The moment James Coulter offered his father's saddle for the terrified white filly, every man in the stockyard knew he'd lost his mind. What they didn't know was that the broke cowboy had just gambled his entire future on 4 legs and a prayer. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust hung thick in the air of the Colorado stockyard that September morning in 1882, coating everything with a fine red powder that turned men's throats dry and made their eyes water. James Coulter stood at the edge of the corral, one boot propped on the lower rail, his weathered hands gripping the worn leather of his saddle, like it was the last solid thing in a world that had gone sideways on him. The saddle was all he had left that was worth anything, a handcrafted piece his father had commissioned from a saddle maker in Santa Fe 20 years back, before the fever took him, and left James an orphan at 14. The leather was the color of aged whiskey, tooled with intricate patterns of prairie roses and running horses, and the silver conchos that decorated it caught the morning light like scattered coins. He was 28 years old and broke as a man could be without actually starving. 3 months ago, he'd been working a decent spread up near Denver, saving his wages and dreaming of the day he'd have enough to buy a small piece of land and start building something that belonged to him. Then the winter had come early and hard, killing half the herd, and the ranch owner had let most of his hands go with nothing but a handshake and 2 weeks' pay. James had drifted south with the other unemployed cowboys, picking up work where he could find it, day labor mostly, just enough to keep himself and his aging gelding fed. But yesterday his horse had stepped in a prairie dog hole and shattered his leg so badly that even the kindest thing James could do was put a bullet in the poor creature's brain. Now he stood in the stockyard with his saddle and $18 to his name, watching a horse trader named Garrett Sullivan parade his stock before a small crowd of ranchers and cowboys. Sullivan was a big man with a voice like thunder and the kind of smile that made you check your pockets after shaking his hand. He moved through the corral with practiced ease, pointing out the qualities of each animal, downplaying their faults, and driving the prices up with the skill of a man who understood that desperation made for good business. James wasn't interested in most of what Sullivan was selling. The good horses were too expensive, and the cheap ones were either too old, too mean, or too broken down to be worth the feed they'd eat. He was about to turn away to head back into town and see if anyone needed a man willing to work for room and board when he saw her. The white filly stood in the far corner of the corral, pressed against the rails as if she could disappear into the wood itself. She was young, maybe 2 years old, with a coat so pure white it seemed to glow in the dusty air. Her head was fine and elegant, her legs long and clean, and there was something in the way she held herself that spoke of bloodlines and breeding that didn't belong in a rough stockyard in Colorado. But there was also fear in every line of her body. She trembled when Sullivan moved too close, her dark eyes rolling white, and when he reached for her halter, she reared back so violently that the rope burned through his hands. He cursed and kicked dirt at her, which only made her press herself harder against the rails, her whole body shaking like leaves in a windstorm. James watched this display with growing interest. He'd grown up around horses, had been riding before he could properly walk, and he recognized spirit when he saw it. This wasn't a mean horse or a stupid one. This was a frightened animal that had been mishandled, probably badly, and didn't trust humans any farther than she could kick them. Sullivan noticed James watching and sauntered over, rubbing his rope-burned palms on his vest. Pretty thing, ain't she? Purebred Arabian. Or so the man who sold her to me claimed. Got her in a card game down in Santa Fe. But she's crazy as a loon, won't let nobody near her. Been trying to break her for 2 months now, but she's got the devil in her. James didn't take his eyes off the filly. What are you asking for her? Sullivan laughed, a big booming sound that turned heads. Son, you don't want that horse. She'll kill you or herself before she lets you ride her. I'm probably going to have to put her down if I can't sell her soon. Can't afford to feed an animal that won't work. How much? James repeated, his voice steady despite the quickening of his pulse. Sullivan studied him for a long moment, taking in the worn clothes, the lean frame that spoke of too many missed meals, and the quality saddle that didn't match anything else about James's appearance. A calculating look crossed his face. Tell you what, since I like you, $50 and she's yours. James felt his stomach drop. He might as well have asked for $50,000. I've got $18. Then I guess we don't have a deal. Sullivan started to turn away. Wait, the word came out before James could stop it, and he found himself walking toward the corral, toward the trembling white filly who watched him with eyes that held both fear and something else, something that looked almost like hope. I'll trade you my saddle for her. The stockyard went quiet. Every man there knew what James was offering. A cowboy's saddle was more than just equipment. It was his profession, his identity, his most valuable possession. Trading your saddle for an unbroken, possibly unbreakable horse was the kind of decision that marked a man as either inspired or insane. Sullivan's eyes went wide with greedy surprise, then narrowed with suspicion. That saddle's got to be worth at least $100. Why would you trade it for a crazy horse you'll probably have to shoot inside of a week? James climbed up on the corral rail, moving slowly, keeping his eyes on the filly. She watched him back, still trembling, still pressed against the far side, but she didn't try to bolt. Up close, he could see the intelligence in her dark eyes, the fine bones beneath the white coat, and something else, a quality he couldn't quite name but recognized all the same. This horse was special. She just needed someone to see past the fear to what lay underneath. Because sometimes you have to bet everything on something that matters, he said quietly. Do we have a deal? Sullivan stared at James for a long moment, his weathered face showing the internal calculation of a man weighing profit against principle. Around them, the other cowboys had gone silent, watching this exchange with the kind of attention men paid to moments that might become stories told around campfires for years to come. Finally, Sullivan spat in the dust and stuck out his meaty hand. You got yourself a deal, Coulter. Though I think you're the biggest fool I've met this side of the Rockies. James shook his hand, feeling the roughness of the rope burns on Sullivan's palm, and tried not to think about what he'd just done. The saddle had been his father's legacy, the one piece of the past that connected him to a time when he'd belonged somewhere, when he'd been part of something larger than just himself and his endless search for work. Now it was gone, traded for a terrified white filly who might never let him touch her, let alone ride her. But as he looked at the horse, still pressed against the far rail but watching him with those intelligent dark eyes, he felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't felt in months. Purpose, maybe, or hope, or just the simple satisfaction of making a choice that felt right even if it looked foolish to everyone else. The transfer of ownership took all of 5 minutes. Sullivan handed James a worn leather halter and a coil of rope, took the saddle with almost reverent care, examining every tooled rose and running horse with the eye of a man who knew quality when he held it, and then walked away whistling, clearly pleased with the trade. The other cowboys drifted back to their business, some shaking their heads at James's stupidity, others offering quiet words of encouragement that felt more like condolences. Within an hour, the stockyard had mostly cleared out, leaving James alone in the corral with his new horse and absolutely no idea how to proceed. He'd broken horses before, of course. Every cowboy had. But those had been ranch horses, already somewhat gentled, animals that might buck and fight but ultimately understood that humans meant food and shelter and a kind of rough partnership. This filly was different. She'd been hurt. That much was clear from the way she flinched at sudden movements, from the white scars on her legs that spoke of ropes pulled too tight, from the way her whole body tensed when he took a step in her direction. Someone had tried to break her the hard way with force and cruelty, and it hadn't worked. It had only taught her that humans were dangerous, that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. James sat down in the dirt about 20 feet from where she stood, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. The Colorado sun beat down on his shoulders, and dust devils danced across the empty corral. But he didn't move. He just sat there, letting the filly get used to his presence, showing her through his stillness that he wasn't going to hurt her, wasn't going to force anything. An hour passed, then 2. His legs cramped and his back ached, but he remained motionless, occasionally talking to her in a low, quiet voice, telling her about his father and the ranch where he'd grown up, about the mountains he'd crossed and the rivers he'd forded, about nothing and everything, just letting her hear the sound of his voice until it became as familiar as the wind. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the filly's trembling began to ease. Her ears, which had been pinned flat against her skull, swiveled forward, tracking the sound of his words. Her weight shifted from flight-ready tension to something closer to cautious curiosity. She was still pressed against the rail, still ready to bolt if he made any sudden movement, but she was listening now, watching him with an intensity that suggested she was trying to figure him out, trying to determine if he was different from the other humans who had hurt her. By the time the sun started its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the corral, James's throat was dry from talking, and his body was stiff from sitting. But the filly had moved. Not much, maybe 3 feet from her position against the rail, but it was progress. She was no longer trying to disappear into the wood. She was standing in the open, her white coat catching the golden afternoon light, and she was looking at him with something that wasn't quite trust, but wasn't pure fear either. James stood up slowly, moving like he was underwater, giving her every chance to bolt. She tensed, her muscles bunching, but she didn't run. He took 1 step toward her, then stopped, waited, took another step. The filly's ears flicked back and forth, her dark eyes tracking every movement, but she held her ground. He was 10 feet from her now, close enough to see the fine network of scars on her legs, close enough to see the rapid rise and fall of her breathing, close enough to see that she was making a choice, deciding whether this human was worth the risk of trusting. He didn't reach for her. Instead, he simply stood there, one hand extended palm up in an offer of peace, and waited. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and still they stood there, man and horse, caught in a moment of decision that would determine everything that came after. Then, so slowly that at first James thought he was imagining it, the filly stretched her neck forward, nostrils flaring as she caught his scent. Her nose was soft as velvet when it touched his palm, and the contact lasted only a second before she jerked back. But it was enough. It was a beginning. "That's my girl," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That's my beautiful girl. We're going to be just fine, you and me. I promise you that." The problem of where to keep the filly presented itself as soon as the euphoria of that first small victory wore off. James had no ranch, no stable, no land to call his own. He had $18, a horse that wouldn't let him near her for more than a few seconds at a time, and no saddle to his name. The stockyard closed at sundown, and Sullivan had made it clear that James needed to move his new acquisition off the property before then. Standing in the gathering dusk, watching the filly retreat to her corner of the corral now that he'd stopped talking to her, James realized the full magnitude of what he'd done. He'd traded his livelihood for an animal he couldn't ride, couldn't sell, and now couldn't even house. The town of Elkhorn Creek spread out beyond the stockyard, a collection of wooden buildings and dirt streets that served the ranches and mining operations scattered throughout the surrounding valleys. James had been through here twice before, once as a boy traveling with his father, and again 3 years ago when he'd worked a summer on the Patterson Ranch north of town. He remembered a livery stable on the east side of town, run by a man named Frank Jessup, who'd struck him as fair and reasonable, the kind of person who might be willing to work out an arrangement with a broke cowboy and his troubled horse. Getting the filly out of the corral proved to be the first real test of the fragile connection they'd begun to establish. James approached her slowly, the halter hidden behind his back, talking in that same low, steady voice he'd used all afternoon. She watched him come, her body tense but not panicked, and when he was close enough, he showed her the halter, letting her smell the leather, letting her see that it was just an object, nothing to fear. It took 20 minutes of patient coaxing before she allowed him to slip it over her head, and even then she trembled so violently that James could feel it through the lead rope. But she didn't fight him, didn't rear or try to bolt, and that small act of trust felt like a victory worth more than gold. Leading her through the streets of Elkhorn Creek as darkness fell was an exercise in patience. The filly startled at every sound, shied away from every shadow, and James had to stop every few yards to let her calm down, to reassure her that the barking dogs and laughing cowboys and clattering wagons weren't going to hurt her. People stopped to stare at them, this dusty cowboy leading a magnificent white filly through town like some kind of strange parade, and James heard the whispers that followed in their wake. "That's Sullivan's crazy horse. Fool traded his saddle for her. Won't last a week before she kills him or he has to shoot her." Frank Jessup was closing up the livery when they arrived, a short, barrel-chested man in his 50s, with kind eyes and work-hardened hands. He took one look at the filly and let out a low whistle. "That's the white Arabian Sullivan's been trying to break. Heard you made a trade for her today. Heard what you gave up to get her too." James felt heat rise in his cheeks. News travels fast. In a town this size, a man trades away a saddle worth $100 for an unbroken horse. Folks are going to talk. Jessup circled the filly slowly, keeping his distance, noting her fine lines and the fear in her eyes. "She's quality stock, no doubt about that, but she's got demons in her, this one. What are you planning to do with her?" "Right now, I just need a place to keep her." James tried to keep the desperation out of his voice. "I can work off the stable fees. I'm good with horses, good with repairs, whatever you need." Jessup studied him for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable in the lantern light. Then he sighed and gestured toward an empty stall at the far end of the stable, away from the other horses. "Put her in there. We'll work something out. But I'm warning you now, if she hurts one of my other animals or causes problems, she's gone, deal or no deal." Relief washed through James like cool water on a hot day. "Thank you, sir. You won't regret this." "I might," Jessup replied, but there was a hint of a smile in his voice. "But I've always had a weakness for fools and lost causes. You seem to qualify as both." Getting the filly into the stall took another hour of patient work. She balked at the doorway, terrified of the enclosed space, and James had to talk her through every step, showing her the fresh hay and the bucket of clean water, demonstrating that the stall was a safe place, not a trap. By the time she finally walked inside, both of them were exhausted, and James's voice was nearly gone from all the talking he'd done. But she was in, standing in the corner of the stall with her head high and her eyes watchful, but in. That night, James slept in the hayloft above the stable, too tired to look for proper lodging and too worried about the filly to leave her alone in this strange place. He lay on his back in the sweet-smelling hay, listening to the sounds of horses shifting in their stalls below, and wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Without his saddle, he couldn't work as a cowboy. Without money, he couldn't afford to keep the filly for more than a few weeks. And without a miracle, he'd probably end up exactly where Sullivan had predicted, having to put a bullet in the beautiful white horse who'd somehow captured his heart in the space of a single afternoon. But as he drifted toward sleep, exhausted and uncertain, he heard a sound from below. The filly was moving in her stall, not pacing in panic, but walking slowly, exploring her new home. And then, clear as a bell in the quiet stable, came a soft nicker, tentative and questioning, as if she were looking for him, as if she'd noticed his absence and wanted to know where he'd gone. James woke before dawn to the sound of Frank Jessup moving through the stable below, feeding the horses and mucking out stalls. He climbed down from the hayloft feeling stiff and sore, his clothes rumpled and covered in hay dust, and found Jessup standing outside the filly's stall with his arms crossed, watching the white horse with an expression that mixed admiration with concern. The filly stood in the far corner, as far from the door as she could get, but her ears were forward and alert, and she wasn't trembling the way she had been yesterday. "She didn't touch her feed," Jessup said without preamble. "Water, neither. That's not a good sign." James felt his stomach clench with worry. He knew horses could go without food for a while, but refusing water was dangerous, especially for an animal already stressed and frightened. He approached the stall door slowly, speaking in that same low, gentle voice he'd used yesterday. "Hey there, beautiful girl, it's just me. Remember me? We're friends now, aren't we?" The filly's ears swiveled toward him, and after a moment she took one hesitant step in his direction. It wasn't much, but it was something. James opened the stall door just wide enough to slip inside, moving with the kind of care a man might use handling dynamite. Jessup made a sound of protest, but James ignored him, his entire focus on the horse watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. He didn't try to approach her directly. Instead, he walked to the water bucket and dipped his hand in, then held it out so she could see the water dripping from his fingers. "It's good water," he said softly. "Clean and cold. You must be thirsty after yesterday." He stood there for what felt like an eternity, his arm extended, water dripping slowly onto the hay-covered floor. The filly watched him, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of the water, and he could see the thirst in her eyes warring with her fear of coming too close to him. Finally, so slowly that at first he wasn't sure she was moving at all, she began to walk toward him. Each step was deliberate, careful, as if she were testing the ground with every hoof. When she was 3 feet away, she stopped, stretching her neck as far as it would go, trying to reach the water without getting any closer. James didn't move, barely breathed, letting her make the decision. Then, with a small snort that might have been resignation or courage, she closed the distance between them and lowered her head to drink from his cupped hand. The feel of her soft muzzle against his palm, the gentle pressure of her lips as she sucked up the water, was one of the most profound moments of James's life. It wasn't just that she was drinking, though that was relief enough. It was that she'd chosen to trust him, to overcome her fear, and accept his help. When his hand was empty, she lifted her head and looked at him, really looked at him. And he saw in her eyes a question, a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, this human was different from the ones who had hurt her before. "That's it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That's my brave girl. Let's get you some more." He refilled his hand from the bucket and offered it again, and this time she didn't hesitate, drinking eagerly now that the barrier had been broken. They stood like that for 10 minutes, James scooping water with his hand and the filly drinking from his palm, until finally she walked past him to the bucket itself and drank deeply, her thirst overcoming the last of her fear. Jessup was still standing outside the stall when James emerged, his weathered face showing a mixture of surprise and something that might have been respect. "Well, I'll be damned," the older man said quietly. "Sullivan had 5 men working with that horse for 2 months and never got her to take water from a bucket. You've had her less than a day and she's drinking from your hand like a pet pony." James felt a flush of pride but tried to keep it from his voice. She just needed someone to be patient with her, to show her that not all humans are cruel. Maybe so. Jessup pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time. "But patience doesn't pay stable fees or put food in your belly. You said you'd work off what you owe. I've got a mare in the back that needs shoeing and 3 stalls that need mucking. If you're as good with regular horses as you seem to be with that white demon, we might have ourselves a useful arrangement." The next 2 weeks fell into a rhythm that felt almost like contentment. James woke before dawn and spent an hour with the filly before beginning his work for Jessup. He'd bring her fresh hay and water, talking to her while she ate, gradually moving closer until he could stand beside her without making her nervous. After that first morning, she never refused water again, and within 3 days, she was eating normally, her white coat beginning to gleam with better health and regular feeding. His days were filled with the kind of honest labor he'd always enjoyed, shoeing horses, repairing tack, mucking stalls, and helping Jessup with the dozen small emergencies that seemed to plague every livery stable. The work was hard but satisfying, and Jessup proved to be a fair man who appreciated competence and didn't waste words on unnecessary talk. In the evenings, after the work was done, James would return to the filly's stall and continue the slow, patient process of building trust between them. He started by simply standing in the stall with her, reading aloud from a battered copy of Shakespeare's sonnets he'd borrowed from the town's small lending library. The filly seemed to like the sound of his voice, and he found something soothing in the familiar rhythms of the poetry, even if half the words made no sense to his frontier-raised ear. On the 10th day, James touched the filly's neck for the first time without her flinching away. It was a cool October morning, and he'd been standing beside her reading about some long-dead English lord's love for his lady, when he reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and laid his hand on her shoulder. She went still, every muscle tensing, but she didn't bolt. He kept his hand there, light and steady, letting her feel that his touch meant no harm, and after a moment, her muscles began to relax. By the time he removed his hand 5 minutes later, she had turned her head to look at him with an expression that seemed almost curious, as if she were trying to understand why his touch felt different from the others who had hurt her. That evening, Frank Jessup invited James to share dinner at the small cabin behind the livery where the older man lived alone. They ate beef stew and cornbread at a rough-hewn table while Jessup's old hound dozed by the fire, and for the first time since he'd made the trade, James felt something like peace settle over him. The work was good, the food was hot, and he had a purpose that went beyond simple survival. "You've got a gift with horses," Jessup said around a mouthful of stew. "Best hand I've had in years, and I've had plenty. Where'd you learn it?" James thought about his father, about the years they'd spent together on that ranch outside Santa Fe before the fever took him. "My pa taught me. He said horses were like people. They just wanted to be understood and treated fair. Said if you couldn't be patient with a horse, you probably couldn't be patient with much of anything worth having." Jessup nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "Wise man, your father. Mine was a drunk who beat anything that couldn't outrun him. Took me 30 years to learn what your pa taught you as a boy." He spooned more stew into his bowl. "That filly of yours, she's coming along faster than I would have believed. Saw you touching her today. That's real progress." "She's special," James said, and heard the emotion in his own voice. "I can feel it. Once she learns to trust again, once she understands that not everyone wants to hurt her, she's going to be something extraordinary." "And what then?" Jessup asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "You planning to keep working here forever, sleeping in my hayloft and shoveling horse manure for your keep?" The question hit James harder than he expected. He'd been so focused on the daily work of building trust with the filly that he hadn't thought much about the future, about what would happen once she was trained and rideable. "I don't know," he admitted. "Haven't thought that far ahead." Jessup studied him for a long moment, then pushed back from the table and walked to a small desk in the corner of the cabin. He returned with a worn leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. "There's $50 here. Payment for the work you've done, plus a little extra. Not charity, mind you. You've earned every penny." James stared at the pouch, his mind reeling, $50 was more money than he'd expected to see in months. "Mr. Jessup, that's too much. I've only been here 2 weeks. And you've done the work of 3 men in that time," Jessup replied. "Plus, I've been thinking, the Patterson Ranch north of here, you said you worked there a few years back?" 3 summers ago, yes, sir. Old man Patterson died last spring. Heart gave out while he was working cattle. His daughter inherited the place, but she's having trouble keeping hands. Word is she's too soft with the men, too willing to listen to hard luck stories, and they take advantage. She needs someone she can trust, someone who knows the work and won't try to cheat her. Jessup leaned back in his chair. "I wrote to her last week, told her about you and your filly. She wrote back yesterday, says if you're interested, there's a job waiting. Decent pay, room and board, and you can bring your horse." James felt his heart begin to race. A real job, a steady position, a chance to do more than just survive day to day. But there was something in Jessup's tone that suggested there was more to this story. "Why would you do that for me? You barely know me." "Because I'm old and I've seen too many good men go bad from lack of opportunity," Jessup said simply. "And because that filly of yours deserves a chance to become what she was meant to be. You can't do that working in a livery stable. You need land, space, time to work with her properly. The Patterson Ranch has all that." That night, James lay in the hayloft with Jessup's offer turning over in his mind like a card in a poker game. A real job. A place where he could work with the filly properly. Maybe even a future that looked like something more than endless drifting. But it also meant leaving Jessup, who'd shown him kindness when he needed it most, and taking a risk on a ranch owner he'd never met. Working for a woman who apparently had trouble commanding respect from her own hands. Below him, he heard the filly moving in her stall, and on impulse he climbed down from the loft and walked to her door. She was standing in the center of the stall rather than pressed into the corner, and when she saw him she nickered softly, that same questioning sound she'd made his first night here. He opened the door and stepped inside, and for the first time, she walked toward him without hesitation, pushing her soft nose against his chest as if seeking comfort or offering it. "What do you think, girl?" he whispered, running his hand down her neck, marveling at the softness of her coat, the warmth of her living body. "Should we take the risk? Should we trust that things might work out if we're just brave enough to try?" The filly huffed against his shirt, her breath warm and sweet with hay, and he took that as answer enough. The Patterson Ranch sat in a valley carved by a creek that ran silver in the autumn sunlight, surrounded by rolling hills that turned gold and red with the changing season. James rode into the property on a borrowed mare from Jessup's stable, leading the white filly on a long rope, and felt something in his chest tighten at the sight of it. The main house was solid timber construction with a wide porch and glass windows that caught the morning light. The barn was well maintained, the corrals properly fenced, and there were signs everywhere of a working ranch that had been built with care and intention. But there were also signs of neglect, fences that needed mending, a barn door hanging crooked on its hinges, and an overall air of things sliding slowly toward disrepair. Catherine Patterson was waiting for him on the porch, and she wasn't what he'd expected. Jessup had called her old man Patterson's daughter, which had conjured images of a young girl barely out of girlhood. But the woman who stepped forward to greet him was close to his own age, tall and lean with dark hair, pulled back in a practical braid, and eyes the color of creek water in spring. She wore men's trousers and a work shirt that had seen better days, and there was something in the way she carried herself that spoke of strength and determination, worn thin by too many disappointments. "Mr. Coulter," she said, her voice pleasant but formal. "Frank Jessup speaks highly of you." James dismounted and removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his dusty clothes and the lack of a proper saddle on the borrowed mare. "Ma'am, I appreciate you giving me a chance." Her eyes went to the white filly, and he saw them widen slightly. "That's a beautiful animal. Frank mentioned you had a horse in training, but he didn't mention she was an Arabian. Got her from a horse trader about 3 weeks ago. She'd been mistreated, but she's coming along." He heard the pride in his own voice and didn't try to hide it. "She's special, this one." Catherine walked down the porch steps and approached the filly slowly, moving with the kind of understanding that told James she knew horses as well as he did. The filly watched her warily but didn't panic, and when Catherine stopped a respectful distance away and simply observed, James saw approval in the woman's expression. "She trusts you. That's good. A horse that trusts her handler will work through anything." She turned back to James. "Frank told me about the trade you made. Your saddle for an unbroken horse most men would have put down." James felt heat rise in his cheeks. Seemed like the right thing to do at the time. "It was either very brave or very foolish," Catherine said, but there was a hint of a smile at the corners of her mouth. "I'm still trying to figure out which. Come on, I'll show you around and we can discuss the work." She led him through the ranch, pointing out what needed doing, and the list was longer than James had expected. The north pasture fence had come down in a storm 2 weeks ago, and her current hands had done a half-hearted repair that wouldn't last another month. The barn needed new shingles on the roof before winter set in properly. 3 of her horses needed shoeing, and one of her breeding mares was favoring her left foreleg and needed someone with a gentle touch to examine her. As Catherine talked, James began to understand what Jessup had meant about her being too soft. She spoke about her hands with a mixture of frustration and resignation, as if she knew they were taking advantage but didn't quite know how to stop it. "How many men do you have working here?" James asked. 4, not counting you if you decide to stay. 2 are decent enough, do their work, and don't cause trouble. The other 2 are drifters I hired when my regular hands left last month. They do the bare minimum and spend most of their time in town drinking away their wages." She paused at the corral fence, looking out over her property with an expression that mixed love and worry. "My father built this ranch from nothing. He came here 30 years ago with $100 and a dream, and he turned it into something that mattered. I'm watching it fall apart, and I don't know how to stop it." The honesty in her voice struck something in James. He thought about his own father, about the legacy that had died with him because James had been too young to hold on to it. "I know what it's like to lose something your father built," he said quietly. "My pa had a good ranch in New Mexico. Fever took him when I was 14, and I was too green to keep it going. Lost everything inside of 2 years." Catherine looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw recognition in her eyes. "Then you understand why I can't let this place fail. It's not just land and buildings. It's my father's life, his work, his dreams. If I lose it, I lose the last piece of him I have left." James nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. "What exactly would you need from me, Miss Patterson?" "It's Mrs. Patterson, actually," she said, and he saw pain flash across her face. "Though I'm a widow now. My husband died 2 years ago. Pneumonia took him the winter after we married." She straightened her shoulders, pushing the grief away with what looked like practiced ease. "What I need is someone who knows ranching, who can fix what's broken and train the horses properly. Someone I can trust to do the work without constant supervision. Frank says you're that man, are you?" James thought about the white filly waiting patiently behind him, about the $50 in his pocket, and the future he'd been trying to build from nothing. "Yes, ma'am, I believe I am. The job pays $40 a month plus room and board. You'll have your own cabin, small but clean, and you can stable your horse in the barn. If you prove yourself, there might be room for advancement." The cabin Catherine showed him was indeed small, barely large enough for a bed, a stove, and a table, but it was weathertight and clean, with a window that looked out over the creek. James had lived in worse places, plenty of them, and the simple fact that this space would be his That he could close the door and have something resembling privacy and permanence felt like luxury. He set his few possessions on the table, the $50 from Jessup, a change of clothes, the borrowed Shakespeare sonnets he'd forgotten to return, and the worn leather halter that had been the first thing the filly had allowed him to put on her. These were the sum total of his worldly goods, and looking at them spread across the table, he felt both the weight of his poverty and a strange sense of freedom. He owned almost nothing, which meant he had almost nothing to lose. Settling the filly into the barn proved more challenging than he'd anticipated. The other horses were curious about the new arrival, and the white filly was skittish around them, ears pinned back and eyes rolling whenever one of the larger geldings tried to approach her stall. James spent the better part of the afternoon moving between stalls, introducing her to each horse individually, letting her see that these animals meant no harm. By evening, she'd calmed enough to eat, though she still watched the barn door nervously as if expecting someone cruel to walk through it at any moment. The other ranch hands were waiting for him when he emerged from the barn as the sun was setting. There were 4 of them, just as Catherine had said. 2 older cowboys who introduced themselves as Pete and Charlie offered firm handshakes and measuring looks that seemed to find him acceptable. The other 2 younger men named Maddox and Greer hung back with the kind of lazy insolence that told James everything he needed to know about their character. Maddox was tall and fair-haired with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, while Greer was shorter and darker with the build of a man who'd done hard labor but had grown tired of it. "So you're the new hand," Maddox said, looking James up and down. "The one who traded his saddle for that crazy white horse. That true?" James met his gaze steadily. "It's true." "Man who'd make a trade like that is either touched in the head or trying to impress someone," Greer added, and there was an edge to his voice that suggested he was testing James, looking for weakness. "Which one are you?" "I'm the one who sees potential where others see problems," James replied calmly. "And I'm the one who's going to make sure the work on this ranch gets done properly." Pete, one of the older hands, let out a low chuckle. "Well, now, that's a bold statement for a man who just arrived. You might want to hold off on telling us how things are going to be until you've been here longer than a day." "Fair enough," James said, recognizing wisdom when he heard it. "But Mrs. Patterson hired me to do a job, and I intend to do it right. If that means working alone, I'll work alone. If it means working alongside you men, I'd be grateful for the help and the company." The tension that had been building seemed to ease slightly. Charlie, a grizzled cowboy who looked to be in his 60s, nodded approvingly. "That's fair talk. You treat us straight, we'll treat you the same. Can't speak for these 2 youngsters, but Pete and me, we remember what it means to do an honest day's work." Maddox and Greer exchanged glances, but said nothing more, drifting away toward the bunkhouse they shared. Pete lingered for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "A word of advice if you're willing to hear it. Those 2 are trouble. They've been taking advantage of Mrs. Patterson's good nature since they got here, doing the least amount of work they can get away with and spending their time gambling and drinking in town. She's too kind-hearted to fire them, says everybody deserves a chance to prove themselves, but they're never going to change. Watch your back around them." James thanked him for the warning and headed back to his cabin as darkness fell over the valley. He lit the lamp on his table and sat down to write a letter to Frank Jessup, thanking him for the recommendation and telling him about his first day at the Patterson Ranch. As he wrote, he found himself thinking about Catherine Patterson, about the way she'd spoken of her father's legacy and the determination in her eyes despite the obvious struggles she was facing. There was strength in her. He could see that, but also a vulnerability that came from trying to honor a memory while the world worked against her. The next morning, James woke before dawn and went straight to the barn to check on the filly. She nickered when she saw him, a sound that made his heart lift with absurd happiness, and pushed her nose over the stall door to greet him. He spent an hour grooming her, talking softly as he worked, telling her about their new home and the work they'd be doing together. Her coat gleamed white as fresh snow under his brush, and when he ran his hands down her legs to check her hooves, she stood perfectly still, trusting him completely now in a way that still felt like a miracle. Catherine found him there as the sun was rising, lighting the barn in shades of gold and amber. She leaned against the stall door, watching him work with an expression he couldn't quite read. She's gentled remarkably for a horse that was supposedly unbreakable. She was never unbreakable, James said, picking out the filly's back hoof with practiced care. She was just scared and hurt. Once she understood that I wasn't going to hurt her, once she learned to trust, everything else followed naturally. Is that how you see it? That simple? There was something in Catherine's voice, a wistfulness that made James look up from his work. Trust is never simple, he said carefully, but it's the foundation for everything else. Without it, you can't build anything worth having. The first month at the Patterson Ranch passed in a blur of hard work and small victories. James threw himself into the tasks Catherine had outlined, starting each morning before dawn and working until darkness made further labor impossible. He repaired the north pasture fence with proper posts sunk deep into the ground, not the hasty patchwork the previous hands had done. He reshod all 3 horses that needed it, taking his time to ensure each hoof was properly trimmed and balanced. He climbed onto the barn roof during a rare dry spell and replaced 24 shingles, working carefully to match the pattern and ensure no leaks would plague them through the winter. And through it all, he continued working with the white filly, building on the foundation of trust they'd established until she would follow him anywhere, respond to the gentlest pressure of his hand, and stand calm while he worked around her. Catherine noticed the changes. He could see it in the way she watched him work, in the approval that softened her features when she inspected a completed task. But there was also something else in her gaze, a curiosity perhaps, or maybe a loneliness that recognized its reflection in him. They fell into a pattern of sharing coffee on her porch in the early mornings before the day's work began, talking about the ranch and the weather, and carefully avoiding anything too personal. But in those quiet conversations, James began to understand that Catherine Patterson was fighting a battle on multiple fronts, trying to maintain a ranch that demanded more than one person could give, trying to honor her father's memory while forging her own path, and trying to earn respect in a world that didn't think women belonged in positions of authority. The trouble with Maddox and Greer came to a head in late November. James had been at the ranch for 6 weeks and had established a routine that the 2 troublemakers clearly resented. While Pete and Charlie were content to follow James's lead on projects, appreciating the efficiency and quality of his work, Maddox and Greer seemed to take every suggestion as a personal insult. They showed up late, left early, and did their work with such obvious reluctance that James found himself redoing half of what they touched. The confrontation happened on a cold morning when frost covered the ground like scattered diamonds. James had asked Maddox to help him move some hay bales to the north pasture, a simple task that required 2 men and maybe an hour of work. But when he went to find Maddox, he discovered the man still in the bunkhouse, playing cards with Greer, both of them clearly having sampled whiskey despite the early hour. "We've got work to do," James said from the doorway, keeping his voice level. "Mrs. Patterson needs that hay moved before the weather turns." Maddox didn't even look up from his cards. "Mrs. Patterson can wait. We'll get to it when we're ready." "You'll get to it now," James said, and this time there was steel in his voice. "You're being paid to work, not to drink and gamble when there's daylight burning." That got Maddox's attention. He stood slowly, his considerable height making him tower over James in the confined space of the bunkhouse. "You don't give me orders. You're just another hand here, same as me." "I'm a hand who does his work," James replied. which is more than I can say for you. Now you can help me move that hay, or you can explain to Mrs. Patterson why it didn't get done." Greer stood as well, and James found himself facing two men who were younger, bigger, and clearly spoiling for a fight. He'd been in enough brawls to know that this situation was balanced on a knife's edge, but he also knew that backing down now would undermine everything he'd been building at the ranch. So he stood his ground, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing calm, and waited to see which way the moment would tip. It was Catherine's voice that broke the tension. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" She stood in the doorway behind James, her voice quiet but carrying an authority that made both Maddox and Greer shift uncomfortably. "Because if there is, I'd very much like to hear about it." Maddox recovered first, plastering on a smile that didn't hide the anger in his eyes. "No problem, Mrs. Patterson. Just discussing the day's work with your new foreman here." "Mr. Coulter isn't the foreman," Catherine said calmly, "but he is right about the hay needing to be moved. So I suggest you both get to it, and we can all pretend this little scene never happened." After Maddox and Greer had stalked off toward the barn, Catherine turned to James with an expression that mixed gratitude and concern. "You can't let them bait you into a fight. They're looking for an excuse to cause trouble, and if you give them one, they'll use it." "I wasn't going to fight them," James said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I was just making it clear that the work needs to get done." "I know, and I appreciate it. But James, you need to understand something about this ranch." She led him away from the bunkhouse toward the creek where they could talk without being overheard. "My father commanded respect through his mere presence. Men listened to him because he was strong and certain and never questioned himself. I don't have that. I have to work twice as hard to get half the respect. And even then, some men like Maddox and Greer see me as weak simply because I'm a woman." James watched the morning light play across the water, thinking about his own struggles, his own losses. "You're not weak. Anyone with eyes can see that." "But they don't see it," Catherine said softly. "They see a widow trying to run a ranch she inherited, and they assume I'll fail. Some of them are even counting on it, hoping to pick up the pieces when I do." The vulnerability in her admission struck something deep in James's chest. The weeks that followed brought the first serious snows of winter, blanketing the valley in white that rivaled the color of James's filly. The ranch work took on the grinding quality that winter always brought to frontier life, a constant battle against cold and ice, and the demands of animals that needed tending regardless of weather. James found himself working closer with Catherine as the winter deepened, the two of them often the only ones willing to brave the worst conditions to ensure the livestock were fed and watered. Maddox and Greer had grown increasingly sullen after the confrontation, doing the bare minimum and spending most of their time huddled in the bunkhouse. Pete and Charlie were reliable, but aging, and James could see the toll the harsh weather was taking on their old bones. Through it all, the white filly continued to flourish. James had progressed from simply handling her to beginning the actual training, working with her in the covered arena attached to the barn where they could escape the worst of the weather. He'd fashioned a saddle pad from blankets since he still had no proper saddle, and he'd spent hours getting her accustomed to the weight on her back, the feel of the girth tightening around her barrel, the strange sensation of a man's weight pressing down on her spine. She'd been nervous at first, her old fears surfacing, but the trust they'd built held firm. By early December, he was riding her at a walk around the arena, marveling at the smoothness of her gait and the intelligence with which she responded to his cues. Catherine often came to watch these training sessions, leaning against the arena rail with a cup of coffee warming her hands, her breath making clouds in the cold air. "She's magnificent," she said one afternoon as James guided the filly through a series of turns and stops. "I've never seen a horse move quite like that. It's like watching water flow." James brought the filly to a halt and dismounted, running his hand along her neck in praise. Arabians are bred for endurance and intelligence. They were war horses once, carrying warriors across deserts. This one, she's got all that breeding plus something extra. Heart, I guess you'd call it. She wants to please, wants to be good at what she does. Like her owner, Catherine said quietly, and when James looked at her in surprise, he saw color rising in her cheeks. I mean, you have that same quality, that determination to do things right, to honor what you've been given. It's rare. Before James could respond, Pete came hurrying into the barn, his weathered face tight with concern. Mrs. Patterson, we've got trouble. Some of the cattle broke through the west fence during the night. They're scattered across half the county by now, and with this snow, we're going to lose some of them if we don't round them up quick. The news hit like a physical blow. Cattle lost in winter storms often froze to death or fell prey to wolves, and each animal lost represented money Catherine couldn't afford to spare. How many got out? She asked, her voice steady despite the worry in her eyes. Maybe 20 head, hard to say for certain. Maddox and Greer are supposed to be checking the rest of the fence line, but I haven't seen them since breakfast. James felt anger kindle in his chest. This was exactly the kind of lazy work that led to disasters. If the fence had been checked properly, maintained properly, the cattle would never have gotten out. I'll go after them, he said, already moving toward where his borrowed mare stood in her stall. If I leave now, I can probably round up most of them before dark. Not on that old mare, you won't, Catherine said. She's steady but slow, and you need speed if you're going to cover that much ground. She looked at the white filly, who stood watching them with alert interest. What about her? Is she ready? James's heart leapt at the suggestion even as his mind raced through the risks. The filly was coming along beautifully, but he'd never ridden her outside the controlled environment of the arena, never asked her to do real work. Taking her out in rough weather to chase scattered cattle would be a test unlike anything she'd faced. But Catherine was right about one thing. She was the fastest horse on the ranch by a considerable margin. And if they were going to save those cattle, speed was essential. I think so, he said slowly. I think she's ready. But if something goes wrong out there, if she panics or bolts, I could lose her or get hurt or both. Catherine met his eyes, and in her gaze he saw an understanding that went deeper than words. She knew what he was risking, knew that the filly represented more than just a horse to him. She was the symbol of the chance he'd taken, the future he was building, the proof that trust and patience could transform something broken into something beautiful. I wouldn't ask if there was another choice, Catherine said, but those cattle are the difference between this ranch surviving the winter or failing, and I trust you to make the right decision. That word again, trust, the foundation of everything. James looked at the white filly, at the intelligent eyes watching him, and made his choice. All right, we'll do it. He turned to Pete. Get me whatever tack you have, that'll work. I need a proper saddle and bridle, best you've got. 20 minutes later, James rode out of the barn on the white filly, and the moment they stepped into the open air, he knew he'd made the right choice. She pranced with excitement, her ears swiveling to catch every sound, her body coiled with energy that had been pent up through weeks of arena training. When he gave her the signal to move forward, she leapt into a smooth canter that ate up the ground beneath them, her hooves barely seeming to touch the snow-covered earth. They found the first group of cattle huddled against a stand of trees, and James worked the filly around them with growing amazement. She seemed to understand instinctively what he needed, responding to the slightest shift of his weight or touch of the reins. The work of gathering the scattered cattle took the rest of that day and well into the evening. James and the white filly moved as one through the snow-covered landscape, finding cattle in ravines and thickets, behind hills and along the frozen creek. The filly never faltered, never spooked, never showed anything but focused determination to complete the task at hand. When a particularly stubborn steer tried to break away from the group, she cut him off with the speed and precision of a horse born to the work, and James found himself laughing with pure joy at her natural talent. By the time they drove the last of the cattle back through the repaired fence as darkness fell, both James and the filly were exhausted, covered in snow and sweat, but triumphant. Catherine was waiting by the gate with Pete and Charlie, and when she saw them coming, her face lit up with an expression that made James's heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with the hard ride. "You found them all," she said, and there was wonder in her voice. "I didn't think it was possible. Not in one day, not in this weather. But you did it." James dismounted stiffly, his legs protesting after hours in the saddle. "We did it," he corrected, running his hand down the filly's neck. "This horse right here, she's the real miracle. I've never ridden anything like her. It's like she can read my mind, like she knows what I need before I ask for it." Pete let out a low whistle of appreciation. "That's the finest piece of cow work I've seen in 40 years of ranching. That filly of yours is something special, Coulter. You were right to trade that saddle for her, foolish as it seemed at the time." As they walked the filly back to the barn, Catherine fell into step beside James, and in the darkness he could feel the warmth of her presence. "I need to tell you something," she said quietly. "Maddox and Greer are gone. They left this morning, took their pay, and rode out without a word." Pete found a note in the bunkhouse saying they'd had enough of winter ranch work and were heading south to Texas. James felt relief wash through him, though he tried to keep it from his voice. That's probably for the best. They weren't suited to this kind of work. No, they weren't. But it means I'm short-handed going into the hardest part of winter. She paused at the barn door, turning to face him. "James, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. This ranch, it's struggling, and I'm barely keeping it afloat. But I think with the right help, with someone I can trust to work beside me, it could be something great again. Something my father would be proud of." James felt his pulse quicken, sensing where this was leading. "What are you asking, Catherine?" "I'm asking if you'd consider staying on permanently, not as a hired hand, but as a partner. I've been thinking about it for weeks now, watching how you work, how you care about this place like it's your own. We could make this ranch thrive together, you and I." She took a breath, and in the dim light from the barn he could see color rising in her cheeks. "And maybe, if we're both brave enough, we could build something more than just a business partnership." The words hung between them in the cold night air, full of possibility and promise. James thought about his father's ranch that he'd lost, about the years of drifting and searching for a place to belong, about the white filly who'd taught him that trust and patience could transform everything. He thought about Catherine's determination and strength, about the way she'd risked trusting him despite her previous disappointments, about the future they could build together if they were willing to take the chance. "I traded my saddle for a horse everyone said was worthless," he said quietly. "Gave up the one valuable thing I owned for something that might have killed me or broken my heart. People called me a fool, and maybe I was. But that trade changed my life, Catherine. It brought me here, to this ranch, to you, and I learned something important from it." "What's that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That sometimes the things that look like the biggest risks are actually the surest bets. That sometimes you have to give up what you thought you wanted to find what you actually need." He reached out and took her hand, feeling the roughness of her work-worn fingers against his own. "Yes, I'll stay. I'll be your partner in the ranch. And if you'll have me, I'd like to be more than that. I'd like to build something lasting here, something neither of us could create alone." Catherine's eyes shone with tears that the cold couldn't account for. "I was hoping you'd say that." In the barn behind them, the white filly nickered softly, as if offering her blessing on this new partnership. James turned to look at her, this magnificent horse who'd been broken and scared when he found her, who'd learned to trust again through patience and gentle handling, who'd proven today that she was worth more than any saddle ever made. She stood in her stall with her white coat gleaming in the lamplight, ears forward and eyes bright, transformed by love and care from something damaged into something extraordinary. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the valley in a blanket of white that promised a hard winter ahead. But inside the barn, inside the circle of light and warmth they'd created together, James felt the bone-deep certainty that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all those years of drifting. Not just a home or a job or even a horse worth keeping, but a future worth building, a woman worth loving, and a second chance at the life his father had wanted for him. He'd traded his saddle for a white filly that September morning in a dusty Colorado stockyard, and that deal had changed his destiny in ways he never could have imagined. Sometimes the best trades weren't about getting equal value, but about having the courage to bet everything on something you believed in, even when everyone else called you a fool.